Hello everybody and Happy New Year. Yep, this video should be coming out in 2017, I think, for most of you. So hope you've all had a great New Year's Eve and you've made your resolutions for 2017. Now, of course, today's video is going to be talking about the 0.60 proposed captain scale changes. Now, of course, still things can change, but from everything that we've seen on the PTS so far, here's sort of like an overview of what's coming. Now, I know there are some skills in particular that people are concerned with, and hopefully in this video I will be able to address those concerns with you. So let's take a look at the skills first. And before I do that, actually, there's one other thing. With the new system, you'll notice that there's something called Elite Commander EXP. So that's basically when you max out a commander, all the extra experience you earn is going to be that Elite Commander experience. And you can use that Elite Commander experience to level up other captains that haven't maxed out yet. So for example, if I want to go from a 15 to 16 point captain, I can spend 189,000 captain experience. And of course, if I wanted to fully max it from a 15 pointer to a 19 pointer, well, I need 970,000, so quite a bit of Elite Commander's experience there. But still, I mean, with Dragonflies and everything, Commander experience can be acquired relatively quickly. So let's take a look at the skills and, well, sort of let you know what I think. Skills, unlike before, are now divided into 4 separate sort of categories. Now, you only need to level 1 at one level before the next level unlocks. So it's not like, if you level endurance, you only get endurance stuff. No, it's like if you get 1 from endurance, you unlock all of 2, and so on and so forth. So first things first, you get a new skill called Priority Target. So this one, you will know how many people are locked onto you. Interesting skill, not as useful. When I tried it out, it just didn't really feel like I got much use out of the skill. So kind of interesting, but not very useful so far. Then you have Preventative Maintenance, and that's changed from where it used to be all the way down to a 1-point skill, and it now offers a 30% reduction to the risk of incapacitation of modules. Potentially, this is useful if you are playing a ship where modules are relatively easy to knock out. Or maybe, let's say you're playing something that depends on secondary guns and you want to make sure those secondary guns don't die. Again, a skill that, I don't really feel like a lot of ships will be taking. Although, interestingly enough, for destroyers, this did seem to be like the only skill choice on the first row. So really, I do feel like maybe destroyers need a little bit of love on that very first row. Maybe have a skill that maybe gives them a little bit more utility. So we'll see. On the attack tree, now you have Expert Loader, so that's a 50% reduction to the reload time when you're switching shells after the shell has been reloaded. Again, some use in some situations, but not a skill that I would take, because there is one particular skill for a lot of ships that actually has a lot of utility, and I'll get to that in a second. So, Expert Loader, not super duper useful in a lot of cases. Then you have Aircraft Servicing Expert. Of course, if you're playing a carrier, you're gonna probably be grabbing this skill because 5% increase to the HP of your carrier-based aircraft means they're harder to shoot down, and of course, 10% reduction in servicing time. If you're a carrier, you're probably grabbing this. Now, the skill I really want to talk about is actually this, Direction Center for Catapult Aircraft. So you actually get an additional catapult aircraft that gets launched. So if you're in a battleship or in a cruiser with catapult fighters, you now send up 2, and they fly in opposite directions of each other. So they essentially create a big circle where they will meet at one point and then continue to go in opposite directions. This is a skill that I think has a little bit too much utility, and I think is really useful for a large majority of ships. Pretty much, if you have a ship that has a catapult fighter, you're probably going to grab this skill. First of all, those fighters are going to deal with incoming attack aircraft. They're going to spot torpedoes in the water. It's just a little bit too much utility for one skill. And this is one that I'm actually quite concerned with, because it's essentially giving somebody a long duration hydroacoustic search, because those aircraft do cover quite a lot of space around you. Just a very kind of puzzling skill to put something with so much utility up on the 1-point cost. So it's just a little, this one I think needs to be looked at in a little bit more detail. Then you have Dogfighting Expert. So an increase to fighter ammunition, and of course, for each tier difference between fighters, you gain additional attack power. Again, probably not going to be picked all that much. Maybe if you were an IJN CV, you might pick it for the additional fighter ammo, but I can't really see the benefits over aircraft servicing experts. So a skill that maybe some CVs will pick, but not a lot. Incoming fire alert is now 1-point skill as well, so that's pretty useful. You know, if somebody's shooting at you from outside of 6-second shell flight time, you get an indicator that somebody's shooting at you. Although, again, like I mentioned before, if you are in like cruisers and stuff like that, the direction center is probably just a more viable pick. And there's, again, not many uses for this one, especially now that you have this particular catapult fighter skill. So, moving on to the final skill on the first row, you have Evasive Maneuver. This is a strange one again. It's supposed to be designed for carriers. Now, from the way that the skill is described, you gain a buff to the detectability and HP of your strike aircraft when they're returning to the carrier. Now, they basically fly slower, but they're stealthier and they're tankier. Not really sure why as a carrier you would take this skill, just because there's other more useful skills to get. And again, the benefits of this only apply when your planes are already coming back. So again, a bit of a questionable skill, especially like I mentioned before, you had certain skills like this direction center for a catapult aircraft that has so much utility and just so much effect, and yet you have skills like this, which is of very, very limited use. Alright, so since I'm playing, I'm actually going to have to go back to my destroyer here. Since I was on a destroyer, I'm going to grab preventative maintenance. Like I said, for destroyers, there's just not much choice here on the very first row. Moving on to the second row, and now we've got both High Alert and Jack of all trades here. So this is pretty cool, because this essentially can give, let's say, battleships a 15% reduction to their damage control parties or repair kits. So kind of useful in combination with each other. And again, a lot of utility there, especially if you're in a battleship and you're thinking about survivability. But that's not the only skills now that you could get on the second row if you were, let's say, a battleship. There's also Expert Marksman, turrets traverse faster. This is still a very, very useful skill. As a carrier, you might want to consider torpedo acceleration. If you have torpedo bombers, faster torpedoes, a little bit less range, but not that important if you are a carrier. Destroyers, however, I would probably pass on this skill unless you are really thinking about getting super fast torpedoes on your destroyer at the expense of range. But again, there's more useful skills now that I feel. First interesting support skill, and a new one, is Smokescreen Expert. So this increases the radius of your smokescreen by 20%. So this is a 2-point skill that, while in random battles might not be super useful, I feel like this skill probably has a lot of utility if you are, let's say, playing either in divisions frequently or in ranked battles or in competitive formats. Because if you have a bigger smoke cloud, and especially if you're like a US destroyer, you can deploy a bigger area for your team to hide in. So I feel like this is a skill that has quite a bit of utility, especially in more competitive formats. Once again, remember, I am currently speccing for a US destroyer, so eventually I'll pick a skill out of this row. You also have Expert Rear Gunner. As a CV, you could grab this, or torpedo acceleration. That's sort of your choice there. You get 10% increase to the self-defense armament of aircraft with rear gunner, so that's kind of the same as the Expert Rear Gunner skill that we have right now. And then in versatility, we have Adrenaline Rush. So this is pretty cool. This is a 0.1% reduction to reload time for all weapons as the ship's HP is being reduced. So this is a skill that I think if you were, let's say, playing something with maybe a little bit more HP, so something like a cruiser, heavy cruiser, the later tiers, maybe battleships, that you could find some utility for this particular skill. Main guns will reload a bit faster, your secondary guns will reload a bit faster. Essentially, every weapon you have will reload faster. Not so useful, I think, for destroyers. Your HP pool is really low. It's very quick to essentially lose a huge chunk of your HP to like one salvo. So maybe not so useful for destroyers, but for cruisers and battleships, I definitely see this skill being pretty useful. And then, of course, we have Last Stand. Okay, if you as a destroyer, you're probably going to grab this. Just allow, if your engine gets knocked out or your rudder gets knocked out, you can keep maneuvering with reduced effectiveness, but you can keep working. Now, for me, as a U.S. destroyer, let's say I'm thinking about a competitive format, I'd probably pick something like Smokescreen Expert, and then move on to the third row for now. So on the third row, fire prevention is on the third row now, and fire prevention is really cool. It's a 3-point skill now, so it's a little bit more expensive than it was before. You have a 7% reduction to the risk of fire, so that, again, we don't know the exact math, but they were thinking about adjusting it to make it more effective in terms of, I'm not sure if it's a chance there, or if it's the actual new effect, and the new effect is basically this. The maximum number of fire sources on a ship is now reduced to 3. So currently on ships you have 4 fire sources. There is 1 on the bow, 1 on the stern, and 2 in the center. With this skill, the 2 center sections become 1 section. And so that actually makes battleships harder to set on fire in multiple places. You can usually maybe get 1, maybe 2 fires, rather than, let's say, in the past where you could get up to 3. So as a battleship, fire prevention now is a very, very useful skill. And if you combine that with things like high alert, jack of all trades, fires maybe not as scary things as they were before. Alright, then you have basics of survivability, which is a 15% reduction to the repair time for fires and from flooding, and to repair things. I don't know. Basic survivability just doesn't feel like it's worth 3 points, especially when you have something like fire prevention, and of course, the 2-point things like jack of all trades and high alert. I just don't feel like basic survivability really fits in the 3-point category, and as a battleship, I would probably avoid that and get fire prevention instead. In offense, torpedo armament expertise, so 10% reduction to the reload of torpedo tubes, faster servicing for torpedo bombers. CVs, you're probably going to grab this if you have torpedo bombers. And of course, certain torpedo boat destroyers might offer this as well. 3-point skill, a little bit more expensive than before, but still has quite a bit of utility. And then, of course, another new skill, emergency takeoff. So now, if your carrier is on fire, planes can still recover and launch, although servicing time is increased by 100% if your ship is on fire. As a carrier, I don't really find this skill to be all that useful. But again, there might be a skill difference here. If you're a lower skill CV player and you do happen to get out of position a lot, or you get bombed a lot and you're on fire a lot, then maybe this skill can be useful. Personally, for me, this skill is just, it's not worth it. I'd rather have torpedo armor and expertise service my torpedo bombers faster. Although, if you are playing, let's say, certain US CV with certain modules that have no torpedo bombers, you might want to think about this one as well. Moving on, and we have basic firing training that has now moved and become a 3-point skill. So there's still the 10% reduction to the reload time of main battery guns, up to 139 millimeters, and your A also gets stronger by 20%. So this is a buff, and this skill is also quite expensive now as well at 3 points. It still has some utility, but not as much as it used to have as a 1-pointer. Of course, there's a lot of other things to pick now. But I'll get to this skill probably a little bit later. Moving on, you also have Superintendent. Now, Superintendent is really useful for a lot of ships because you get 1 additional charge, things like smoke, speed boost, repair kits, all those nice goodies. Extra charges of sonar or radar, extra charges for catapult fighters, which again, if you think about skills like this, direction center for catapult aircraft, you might want to consider it, right? So Superintendent's still really, really useful skill, and it's the same 3-point cost, so definitely a skill that is still worthwhile. And then, of course, you have Demolition Expert, which has been downgraded from a 4-point skill to a 3-point skill, and its effect has changed. It's been reduced a little bit. So now it's plus 2% to your chance of fires with your main guns, secondary guns, and or bombs. So this skill is kind of an interesting sort of change. A 2% increase, if you're in a destroyer, you can still get this. It's got less of an effect for cruisers now, I think. But for certain ships like maybe the Bismarck or the German battleships where they depend on their secondaries, this could be a pretty useful skill for them. But yeah, like now the skill is not the universal you must get. There's other options as well. And then, of course, there is Vigilance, which is the good old skill, same as before, plus 25% chance to the acquisition range of torpedoes. Again, this time, I'm probably gonna pick basic firing training for now, and I'll come back to see what other options are available later. And then finally, no 5th row skill anymore. It's only 4th point row. And this 4-point row, you have manual secondary control. Same as the current manual secondary. You get a 15% reduction between tiers 1 and 6, and a 60% reduction to dispersion from 7 to 10. There's also Survivability Expert, so plus 400 HP for each tier that you go up in terms of ships, up to a maximum 4,000 HP up to tier 10. And then we have Inertia Fuse for HE shells, or we might as well just call this high explosive armor piercing. Maybe it might be an easier way to remember this. Basically, right now, although I think the skill is rumored to change a little bit more, you're getting additional armor penetration with the HE shell, and you're getting a 6% reduction to your fire chance. So basically, if you want to talk about like HE pen, essentially caliber of shell maybe divided by 6 is roughly what you're getting. And so this can increase that by another 25%, but you get a huge reduction to fire chance. So who will find this skill useful? Japanese cruisers I found to benefit from this skill relatively well. The Zao being the strange exception, but up to Ibuki I found Japanese cruisers to do pretty well with this particular skill. Their fire chance is still reasonably okay if they pack Demo Expert. The reduction is not as bad. Destroyers, you don't get the skill at all. You pass. Battleships, you could. Certain battleships, I guess, could benefit from the skill, although its performance didn't really impress me all that much when I used it on battleships. And then, of course, Air Supremacy. It's easier to get now, only a 4-point skill, plus 1 fighter, plus 1 dive bomber. If you're a carrier, you're probably going to grab this just because it's a really strong skill. AFT is now a 4-point skill. You get 20% increase to the firing range of guns up to 139 millimeters and a 20% bonus to a defense range. So useful skill, hasn't changed from what it used to be. And then you've got manual A fire control. That's plus 100% damage to A with above 85 millimeter caliber. So large caliber A benefits from this. Again, it's also against specifically designated targets as well. So some utility depending on the ship. And it's, I guess, if you're thinking about it for AA, you can compare AFT and this skill and decide really where you're going to get the benefit. So for example, if you were in a Des Moines, manual fire control for AA, not as useful. You might as well get AFT. And then let's talk about the skill that's generating quite a bit of controversy. Radio position finding. This is a skill that shows the general direction to the nearest enemy ship, even if that ship is stealthed up. So what you see on your screen is like a white line, a white circular line sort of, that shows a general direction of where the nearest enemy ship is. The enemy ship will be alerted that they are now having their bearings taken, and of course the skill doesn't apply if you are in a carrier, although it's currently bugged. And this skill is generating a lot of controversy. People are like absolutely convinced that this skill is completely game breaking, it's going to ruin everything. And I don't think so, but I will get back to that in a second. Right now I'm just telling you what the skill does. And finally, of course, good old Concealment Expert, same as before, although now only a 4-point skill. Alright, so 10% reduction in detectability to destroyers, 12% for cruisers, 14% for battleship, and 16% for aircraft carriers. Alright, so as a destroyer, obviously Concealment Expert is still relatively important, especially as a US destroyer. Although as Russian destroyers, you probably not get the skill. Alright, so let's say I've gotten through the first bunch of skills. Now I've got 9 points left, so I can still get either 2 more 4-point skills and a 1-point skill, or I can get some combination of 2, 3, and 4-point skills, etc. So let's sort of talk about the controversial skill right now, which is radio position finding. People are absolutely convinced, or at least a lot of people are convinced, that this skill is game breaking and is completely broken. I don't agree with that. Namely because with so many new skills, and sort of the way they're, a lot of skills have moved up now to 4-point, and there's so many additional builds, it's not the go-to skill in a lot of cases. So let's take, for example, US destroyers, right? If you take radio position finding, so let's assume you take this skill, right? And so let me do that right now. Let's assume you take that skill. Okay, you got 5 points left. So 5 points left, what else can you take? Well, you can take either one more 4-point skill. So either you can take advanced firing training. Although if you take advanced firing training, you lose access to the ability to take Demo Expert or any of the other 2-point skills, including Last Stand. Or if you took Last Stand, you couldn't take Smokescreen Expert or Expert Marksman. That's a very costly 4-point skill, right? So if you abandon AFT, you don't get the range. Now, US destroyers, you can argue, don't need it. So, okay, so then let's say you go ahead and you take Demo Expert. Well, once you do that, you've only got 2 skill points left. Take a pick. Last Stand, Expert Marksman. Which one do you want? Right? And so you can either have one or the other. All right, so let's say as a US destroyer, let's say you want to build for competitive, right? So you get preventative maintenance first. So what I'm going to do is sort of talk about the sort of competitive or random builds, right? So let's assume you're going to go for competitive for a second. Okay, so you get that. You probably want to get either Last Stand or Smokescreen Expert, your pick. So let's say you want Last Stand because you don't want your engines and rudder to be useless. Okay, that's fine. You move up to the 3-point skill and you get Superintendent because you need that extra smoke charge for your team. Now you still need stealth. As a destroyer, you're still going to need that concealment ability, right? In case you have to go sort of standoffish with another enemy destroyer. You don't want to lose out on that. Don't want them to spot you first, even if they are packing radio position finding. So let's say you get Concealment Expert. All right, now let's say you're now as stealthy as you can get. As a destroyer, you might get into a gun battle with other destroyers. And in competitive, a lot of the high-ranking competitive people found that, for example, skills like Survivability Expert is a huge benefit on ships like the Benson, right? Because if you have that, your HP increases to 18,600, making you that much tankier and that much harder to kill. Well, if you do that, like I mentioned before, you're down to those 5 points. So now you've got to decide, do you want your guns to fire faster? Because in a gunfight, in a close-range gunfight, you're going to need that DPS. That extra 10% helps a lot. All right, do you want maybe the extra range for extra harass? There's so many additional choices that you have to make now about what you want to do. Again, that particular radio position finding skill is not a definite win-win skill, right? Because if you took this skill, you got 3 of those 4-point skills, you give up BFT, AFT, you give up Demo Expert, you give up those skills that can offer quite a bit of benefits. You even give up Expert Marksman, right? Is that really worth it? Not really, and if you don't take it, at least you have a little bit of flexibility. Get maybe a 2-point skill and a 3-point skill, a little bit more flexibility there. Okay, what if you're playing a Russian destroyer? Because that's another argument I've seen. Oh, if you're playing a Russian destroyer, that's something you want to build for. All right, so assuming for a minute that I'm not actually on my Moskva, that I'm on my Khabarovsk for a minute, how would I build it? Well, again, similar problems you'll have at the beginning. Preventative maintenance probably being the better one, or maybe even as Khabarovsk you want incoming fire alert, or heck, maybe even priority target, just to know how many people want to actually kill you. So okay, let's assume I took priority target this time as a Russian destroyer. Okay, you face similar problems, by the way, as a Russian destroyer. Okay, look at most of these skills. You probably want Last Stand, right? So okay, so that's pretty much a set skill you pretty much have to get. On the third row, Russian gunboat destroyer, you're almost completely dependent on, let's say, your guns to do most of your damage. So now you've got to decide, do you want faster firing or do you want Demo Expert? Let's assume you want a gunboat, and let's say you want both, right? So you take basic firing training, you take Demolition Expert. All right, so what now? You've got 10 points left, and let's say as a Russian destroyer, let's say you pass on concealment. As a Khabarovsk, you pass on concealment, right? You assume that you're going to be spotted anyways. Concealment's not important. So let's assume you go and get radio position finding. So now you can actually see where that nearest enemy destroyer is and try to chase them down. If their enemy destroyer plays a smart game, they're going to have a good chunk of distance where they see you and you don't see them. They can still run away from you. I mean, yeah, sure, you're really, really fast, but hey, they have that extra range advantage. Do you really want to pursue them? You might run into other enemy ships. In a one-on-one situation, I think this skill, in certain scenarios, like I mentioned earlier, could be useful, but how many times does that actually happen? Okay, and let's say once you get this skill, and let's say you want gunboat because let's say you do want some range because Khabarovsk now, let's say, really needs it, so you get advanced firing training. Okay, you're down to 2 points now. 2 points. Okay, maybe Expert Marksman could be a skill. That could be something you could get. Maybe you want to opt for something like Smokescreen Expert. Okay, so let's say you go, let's say Smokescreen Expert. Let's say you want to help your team just sometimes, right? A little bit bigger. Okay, so take a look at what you've had to give up. You had to give up Superintendent, so an extra charge of your smoke, your speed boost, you had to give that up. You had to give up, in some cases, Survivability Expert, which gave a pretty big hefty boost to Soviet destroyers. So this skill, which is, I still believe, very situational, that it's useful in some circumstances, not all that helpful. Not all that helpful because you have to give up a lot of other useful skills. As a battleship, it's even more extreme, right? Let's assume that you're talking about a battleship. Let's assume that let me move my Benson Captain over here. Let's assume you're playing a Montana, right? Let's assume you're playing a Montana. You've got a 19-point Montana captain, or any other battleship captain for that matter. All right, so as a battleship captain, you go direction center for catapult aircraft because that skill, I feel like this skill is going to be more damaging to destroyers, actually, because your torpedoes are more likely to be spotted, and I think there's an overall damage reduction that's going to happen, not from the other skill, but from this one, actually, is my bet. All right, but anyways, okay, so you get that 1-point skill. 2-point skill as a battleship, what do you want? Well, there's a lot of choices now. You've got Expert Marksman, you want your turrets to traverse a little bit faster. Important for some battleships. Right? Maybe you want to get high alert. You want to have your damage control parties be on faster cooldown. All right? Let's assume that I don't like being on fire much, so I get that. 3-point skills, loads of choices now. Again, you've got the fire prevention skill. So, hey, less chances of being on fire and losing HP that way. Not a bad choice. But if you think about it, you've also got something like basic firing training. So that improves your AA power. Makes your secondary guns shoot faster. So if you're like a Bismarck, what do you choose, right? For example, do you want Superintendent? Don't forget, you want that. Do you want that extra heal or not, right? Choices. There's a lot of choices here. Personally, let's say I don't like being on fire. Let's say I really despise fires. Okay, so I get fire prevention. Cool. Now I've got the 4-point skills to worry about. Let's say I'm in a Montana and I still want to be effective against aircraft. So I get advanced firing training. If you were in a secondary built battleship, you're going to get advanced firing training and manual secondaries. Now, if you do that, you're taking away another 8 points. There's not much points left after that. As a battleship, let's say I get AFT. As a Montana. Okay, so I've got 9 points left. What do I choose now? So Montana, as maybe a lot of you understand, a little bit vulnerable as a battleship. Maybe you want to go stealth Montana. Go Concealment Expert, get super stealthy. Or let's say you pass on the 4-point skills because the other 2- and 3-point skills have a lot of utility. Hey, maybe I still want to have my additional heal. I do use my heals a lot, actually. So let's say I sacrifice 3 more points. I've got 6 left. I want to get Expert Marksman. My turrets, especially if I'm getting up close to things, I might need that. I might need that extra little bit of turret traverse. Battleship turrets normally traverse too slowly. Expert Marksman, 4 points left. See the problem? It's like you have to make very hard decisions as to what kind of skills you want. Now, let's assume for a minute that you want to build, let's say, a secondary battleship. So let's say a Bismarck or something. Again, direction center for a catapult aircraft. Seriously, skill with way too much utility in my opinion. Let's say you get high alert, right? Oh, actually, here's another thing you have to decide. As a secondary build, do you maybe want to get Adrenaline Rush? Hey, maybe your secondary guns fire faster this way, so if you get this and you combine it with basic firing training, they will fire faster as you lose more HP as you're trying to close the range. That's a choice that you can make as well. So, hey, now you've got to choose. Do you want additional survivability? Do you want your guns to fire faster as your HP gets lowered? All right, assuming that I want to do Adrenaline Rush, which is perfectly viable too, and let's say I'm trying to go for a secondary build, which, by the way, now Demo Expert is a great choice as well. So let's say Demo Expert to get those additional fires. I want manual secondary control. I want, let's say, AFT to get that extra range. I have 5 points left. See the choices now? Look at all the choices that are still open. Fire prevention, so you don't take as much fires as a 3-pointer. Superintendent is a 3-pointer. You can take one or the other, but not both. Basic firing training is still there, so additional fire rate as well. So if you're in a secondary build, maybe you want to go there. You want to really buff those secondaries to the limit. You get basic firing training. Once you take that, you've only got a 2-point skill left. So high alert, expert marksman. this skill, radio position finding, would never apply to a battleship that's running a secondary build, for example. There's very few ships in the game that I've honestly said, okay, I can see this skill being somewhat useful for. One of them is actually the Moskva, if you can believe it. The Moskva, with its super long-range radar, and I guess the other Russian cruisers with that longer range radar, I could see having some use for that particular skill. Just because, hey, if I get a general sense there's a destroyer there and I can estimate the distance, because you could do some estimation, right? Depending on how many enemy ships are around you, you can make an estimate and say, okay, I think there's something there. Maybe pop your radar, maybe get a couple of shots off. Moskva was one of the very few ships that I thought, hey, this skill could probably work on. But a lot of the other cruisers, as you know, I showed you with that secondary build, or with the normal Montana build, or with, all right, assuming that, let's say, a destroyer build, or even cruiser builds, there's just so many other skills that are as valuable or have, you know, more utility than that one particular skill, that I really don't think it's as big of a problem as people think. Still, in competitive environments, there's, you know, if you have the right kind of setup, maybe it'll have some use eliminating that first destroyer. But I mean, if you want destroyers to be spotted in a competitive format, I mean, carriers are just as effective at doing that than this skill plus some surface ship. All in all, I think this new tech tree is really interesting because it's giving tons, just absolutely tons more builds. I mean, you already saw it, right? As a battleship, you had to make those hard choices. Do you want this? Do you want this? What do you want a little bit more of? What do you want a little bit less of? The same is true for cruisers. And even that, by the way, that HEAP skill, right? Like, see, if you were playing a Japanese cruiser and you got that, you pretty much, you know, want to get Demo Expert to reduce that sort of, I guess, effect to your fire chance. And once you did that, that's a huge chunk of points that you've paid out. Speaking of this Inertia Fuse for HE shells one, what I did find about this particular skill is that while your fire damage from fires got reduced because you were setting less fires, your HE damage did feel a little bit more consistent. So again, I did only see the skill as being really that viable sort of skill for cruisers, and in particular Japanese ones with already pretty darn good fire chance. Other nations maybe won't see as big of a benefit, although I guess Moskva could benefit from the skill as well. Although when I used it, I wasn't all that impressed. Anyways, folks, that's pretty much the preview of the skills, and of course addressing some of the concerns regarding, you know, that radio position finding skill. Everything else I thought was just okay, with the one exception of this skill, the direction center, which I actually think is a bigger threat to destroyers, and I really think that Wargaming should look at this skill in particular and see if maybe that's a little bit too much utility for a one-pointer. Anyways, folks, hope you have a really good beginning of 2017. If you know, whatever you think about these things, let me know in the comment section below. Aside from all that, take care, and I'm looking forward to talking to all of you again really soon.